In the spring of 1206, on the banks of a half-frozen river in the heart of the Mongolian steppe, a man who had once been a slave with a wooden collar locked around his neck stood before a sea of warriors. They lifted him onto a felt carpet, raised him above their heads, and gave him a new name, Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. Behind him gathered perhaps 100,000 riders, men drawn from a scattering of poor, freezing, endlessly feuding tribes who owned almost nothing. No cities, no written language, no roads, no stone walls, no fields of grain. By every measure that mattered to the great civilizations of the age, these people were nobodies, herders chasing sheep across an ocean of grass. Within a single lifetime, they would build the largest continuous land empire the world has ever known, an empire stretching from the rice paddies of southern China to the gates of Hungary, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the warm rivers of Persia. They would burn the richest cities on earth, topple dynasties that had stood for 1,000 years, and kill, by some estimates, as many as 40 million human beings. And they would do almost all of it on horseback, with a weapon made of nothing more than wood, horn, and sinew. How? How did 100,000 riders from the poorest corner of Asia conquer most of the known world? How did a boy who grew up eating roots and marmots just to survive become the most feared name on the planet? And why, 8 centuries later, do roughly 1 in 200 men alive today carry his genetic signature in their blood? Stay with me, because this is the story of how the world was very nearly swallowed whole. To understand the Mongols, you first have to understand the land that made them. The steppe is not a gentle place. It is a vast, treeless grassland that runs for thousands of miles across the spine of Asia, scorching in summer, murderous in winter, when the temperature collapses to 40 below and the wind cuts straight through to the bone. Almost nothing grows here that a human can eat, so the people of the steppe did not farm. They followed their animals, sheep, goats, and above all, horses. A Mongol child was placed on a horse before they could walk. By the age of 3, they could ride. By the age of 5, they could shoot a bow from the saddle. Life on the steppe was a permanent apprenticeship in the 2 skills that would one day terrify the world, riding and killing. But the steppe tribes were divided. Mongols, Tatars, Karites, Naimans, Merkits. They raided each other for horses, for women, for revenge. They formed alliances and shattered them. No one had ever united them, because uniting them seemed impossible. And into this world of blood feuds, around the year 1162, a boy was born clutching, the legend says, a clot of blood in his tiny fist. His name was Temujin. His childhood reads like a catalogue of disasters. When he was 9, his father was poisoned by enemies. The moment he died, his clan abandoned the family, leaving his mother to raise her children alone on the open steppe, surviving on roots, fish, and whatever they could scavenge. As a teenager, Temujin killed his own half-brother in a quarrel over food. He was captured by a rival tribe and held as a slave, that wooden collar locked around his neck before he escaped in the dead of night. Everything in his early life taught him the same brutal lessons. Loyalty is everything. Betrayal must be answered. And a man with nothing can still possess a will of iron. Slowly, Temujin began to gather followers. And here, he did something revolutionary. In a world where you rose by the blood you were born with, Temujin promoted men on merit. He did not care if you were the son of a chief or the son of a shepherd. If you were brave, loyal, and capable, you rose. If you were treacherous, you died, no matter how noble your birth. He shared the spoils of war with his soldiers instead of hoarding them for the aristocracy. He protected the families of men who fell in battle. For ordinary steppe warriors who had been treated like cattle their entire lives, this was electrifying. Tribe by tribe, through war and diplomacy and sheer force of personality, he bound the steppe together. And in 1206, they made him Genghis Khan. He gave his new nation a written law, the Yasa, and a script to record it in, borrowed from a conquered people because the Mongols had never written their own language down. He banned the abduction of women, the theft of livestock, and outlawed the blood feuds that had torn the tribes apart for generations. He declared that every religion would be tolerated, and that priests of every faith would pay no taxes. For the first time in living memory, the steppe had order. Now he had 100,000 of the finest horsemen on earth, united for the first time in history under a single command. The only question left was where to point them. The answer lay in the machine he had built. Because the Mongol army was not just a mob of raiders, it was, for its time, the most sophisticated war machine on the planet. It was organized on the decimal system, squads of 10, companies of 100, regiments of 1,000, divisions of 10,000, called a two-men. Crucially, these units mixed men from different tribes on purpose, so that a soldier's loyalty was to the army and to the Khan, not to his old clan. The ancient tribal divisions were deliberately dissolved. At the heart of it all was the horse and the bow. Every Mongol warrior rode with a string of several horses, switching mounts to keep them fresh, which meant a Mongol army could cover distances that left their enemies in disbelief. 60, 80, even 100 miles in a day. They carried their food with them, dried meat and curdled milk, and in desperate moments they could open a small vein in a horse's neck and drink the blood without killing the animal. They needed no supply train, no bakeries, no slow foraging, no creaking wagons. They were, in effect, the world's first truly mobile army. And then there was the composite bow. Built from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, it was small enough to fire from horseback, yet powerful enough to punch through armor at a range no European longbow could match. A Mongol horse archer could loose arrows while riding at full gallop, releasing the shot in the split second when all 4 of the horse's hooves left the ground, so that nothing disturbed his aim. They practiced a tactic so effective it still carries a name to this day: the feigned retreat. They would charge, then appear to break and flee in panic. The enemy, scenting victory, would give chase, their formation falling apart. And then the Mongols would twist around in the saddle and pour arrows back into them, turning the hunters into the hunted in a matter of minutes. But the most terrifying weapon in the Mongol arsenal was not the bow, it was fear. Genghis Khan understood psychology better than almost any commander in history. When a city resisted, he made an example of it so horrifying that the next city would think very carefully before closing its gates. Whole populations were put to the sword. Skulls were piled into pyramids outside the walls. Rumors of these massacres raced ahead of the army, and by the time the Mongols actually arrived, cities frequently surrendered without a fight, paralyzed by terror. Cruelty, for Genghis Khan, was not rage, it was strategy, a cold tool to make conquest cheaper. He also did something his enemies never expected. He learned. The Mongols had no engineers, no siege technology, no way to crack a walled city. So when they conquered people who did, Chinese engineers, Persian craftsmen, Muslim siege experts, Genghis Khan absorbed them. He took their catapults, their gunpowder, their trebuchets, their knowledge, and turned it against the next target. The Mongols stole the best ideas of every civilization they met and made them their own. They were sponges with swords, and before the Mongols ever drew a bow against a new enemy, they had already studied it for years. Genghis Khan ran one of the most effective intelligence networks of the medieval world. Merchants, travelers, and spies fed him a constant stream of information about the roads, the rivers, the rival lords, and the hidden weaknesses of the lands he meant to take. He knew which cities hated their rulers, which generals could be bribed, which kingdoms were quietly at war with their neighbors. By the time the horsemen appeared on the horizon, the Mongols often understood the enemy's kingdom better than the enemy did. They did not gamble, they prepared. The first great target was China, then divided into competing kingdoms. The Mongols smashed into the Jin dynasty in the north, and after years of brutal campaigning, they took its great capital and learned, at last, how to break the most formidable walls in the world. But the truly fateful moment came not in the east, but in the west. Far to the west lay the Khwarezmian Empire, a vast and wealthy Muslim state covering Persia and Central Asia, studded with some of the most beautiful and sophisticated cities on earth. Samarkand, Bukhara. Genghis Khan had no quarrel with them. He wanted trade, so he sent a caravan of merchants and an offer of peace. The governor of a frontier city called Otrar accused the merchants of being spies and executed every single one. Still seeking a peaceful resolution, Genghis Khan sent envoys to demand justice. The Khwarezmian Shah had one of them killed and sent the others back with their beards burned off. It was one of the most catastrophic decisions in human history. The fury that descended on the Khwarezmian Empire is almost beyond description. The Mongols came not to raid, but to annihilate. Cities that had stood for centuries were wiped from the map. The populations of Samarkand and Bukhara were slaughtered or enslaved. In the city of Nishapur, after a beloved Mongol son-in-law was killed in the siege, the survivors were massacred so completely that the heads of men, women, and children were piled into separate pyramids. The dead across the whole campaign run into the millions. Ancient irrigation systems that had fed the region for 1,000 years were torn apart and never rebuilt. The Shah himself fled, hunted across his own collapsing empire by Mongol generals, until he died, exhausted and alone, on a tiny island in the Caspian Sea. An entire empire erased because of a murdered caravan. By now, Genghis Khan was an old man, but the conquering never stopped. He died in 1227, on campaign, as always. The exact cause and place remain a mystery, and according to legend, the soldiers escorting his body home killed everyone they met along the way, so that the location of his grave would never be known. To this day, no one has found the tomb of Genghis Khan. Here is what should have happened next. Empires built by one extraordinary man usually die with him. The sons fight, the whole thing splinters, and within a generation it is gone. But the Mongol Empire did not collapse when Genghis died. It grew, far larger. His son Ogedei became the next great Khan, and under him the Mongols exploded outward in every direction at once. And it was now that Europe got its first taste of the storm. In the late 1230s, a Mongol army under the brilliant General Subutai, perhaps the greatest commander you have never heard of, smashed into the Russian principalities. City after city fell. Kiev, one of the great cities of the medieval world, was reduced to rubble, its people butchered. The Russian lands would live under Mongol domination, the so-called Tatar yoke, for the next 240 years. Then Subutai did the unthinkable. He kept going. In the winter of 1241, the Mongols invaded Catholic Europe, and they did it with a coordination that stunned the continent. They split their forces. One army crushed a combined host of Poles and Germans at Legnica. Just 2 days later, and hundreds of miles away, the main force annihilated the army of the King of Hungary at the Battle of Mohi. Europe's heavily armored knights, the supposed masters of the battlefield, were outmaneuvered, outshot, and slaughtered. The road into the heart of Europe lay wide open. Vienna, Rome, the Atlantic. There was nothing left that could stop them. And then came the most extraordinary twist in the whole story. They left. In the spring of 1242, at the very moment Europe lay helpless, the Mongols simply turned their horses around and rode back east. Why? Because thousands of miles away, the great Khan Ogedei had died, and Mongol law demanded that the princes return to the homeland to elect a successor. Western Europe was saved not by its armies, not by its castles, not by its knights, but by the death of a man it had never seen on the far side of the world. History turned on a single funeral. The empire kept expanding for decades more. Genghis Khan's grandson Hulagu drove into the Middle East, and in 1258 he arrived at the gates of Baghdad. For 500 years, Baghdad had been the jewel of the Islamic world, the city of peace, the center of learning where the wisdom of Greece, Persia, and India had been gathered and translated. The Mongols besieged it, broke it, and then unleashed a week of destruction so total that it broke something in the soul of a civilization. Hundreds of thousands were killed. The libraries were emptied into the river Tigris, and it is said the water ran black with the ink of countless books, then red with the blood of the scholars who had written them. The golden age of medieval Islam never fully recovered. Meanwhile, another grandson, Kublai Khan, finally completed the conquest of all of China and founded his own dynasty, the Yuan. He moved his capital to the site of modern Beijing and ruled an empire of staggering wealth. This was the same Kublai Khan whose pleasure dome would one day be immortalized in English poetry, and whose court would welcome a young Venetian traveler named Marco Polo. But the empire was now so vast that it had reached its limits, and it began to discover them. Twice Kublai sent enormous fleets to invade Japan, and twice, as the invasion force lay off the Japanese coast, a colossal typhoon rose out of the sea and shattered the Mongol ships, drowning tens of thousands. The Japanese called these storms the kamikaze, the divine wind, the sacred gift that saved their islands. The steppe horsemen who had conquered half the planet on land had finally met an enemy they could not outride, the sea. And that, in the end, hints at why it all eventually unraveled. The empire had grown too big for any one man to hold. After Kublai, it fractured into 4 separate khanates that increasingly went their own way, sometimes even fighting one another. The Mongols, masters of conquering, were never quite as gifted at the slow, patient work of governing. And as they settled into the lands they had taken, they were absorbed by them. In Persia and Central Asia they became Muslim. In China they became, in many ways, Chinese. The conquerors were quietly conquered by the cultures beneath them. But before they faded, the Mongols gave the world something nobody expected. For about a century, an enormous stretch of Asia was united under a single power, and the trade routes that crossed it became safer than they had ever been. Historians call it the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. They built a relay system called the Yam, a chain of staging posts stretched across thousands of miles, where an official rider could leap onto a fresh horse and gallop on, carrying a message across the breadth of Asia in a matter of days. A merchant could, in theory, travel from the Black Sea all the way to China under Mongol protection. Goods, technologies, and ideas flowed across the continent as never before. Gunpowder, printing, and the compass began their long journey westward toward Europe, where one day they would help bring an end to the very medieval world the Mongols had terrorized. And something else traveled those same roads. In the 14th century, a disease moved out of the steppe, carried along the trade routes the Mongols had opened, and reached Europe. We know it as the Black Death. The plague that killed perhaps a third of an entire continent rode west, in part on the very network of connection the Mongols had built. The empire that united the world also helped to unite its diseases. So what do we make of them? It is tempting to see the Mongols as nothing but a hurricane of destruction. And the destruction was real, on a scale almost impossible to imagine. But they were also empire builders who practiced religious tolerance long before it was fashionable, who created an international postal system, who protected merchants, who valued skill over birth, and who stitched the two halves of the world together for the first time. They were, all at once, among the most destructive and the most transformative forces in the whole of human history. 100,000 riders, no cities, no writing, no walls. Starting from the poorest grassland on earth, they redrew the map of the world, and the world has never quite been the same since. The empires they shattered are dust. The borders they drew have long since shifted, but the connections they forced open between East and West, between civilizations that had never touched, those never fully closed again. If you enjoyed this ride across the steppe, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because there are far more stories like this one on the way. And before you go, I want to hear from you. Do you think Genghis Khan was a monster, a genius, or both at once? And which empire would you like us to bring back to life next? Let me know down in the comments, and I will see you in the next one.